Good evening and welcome to episode 16 of ListenIn and our second session of Read Along with Sunaparanta. Today we have with us two novels that delve into the lives of children in the corners of large cities, and we also have wonderful encounters with child narrators. I'm thrilled to have with us Mathangi Subramanian and Deepa Anappara, whose novels have won popular and critical acclaim across the world. Thank you both for being with us today and balancing time zones, waking up early, making time midday to be here. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure all our book club attendees appreciate that as well. I'm going to introduce both our authors as well as our moderator for today very briefly, and then hand it over to Urvashi, who will moderate today's session. Mathangi Subramanian is an award-winning South Asian American author and educator who believes that stories have the power to change the world. Her novel, A People's History of Heaven, was longlisted for the Faulkner Award and the Centre for Fiction First Novel Prize. It was also a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and the PFC Valley of Words Prize. Deepa Anappara was born in Kerala and worked as a journalist in India for 11 years. Her reports on the impact of poverty and religious violence on the education of children won several awards, including the Developing Asia Journalism Award. Her debut novel, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line, has been longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction and the JCB Prize for Literature this year. It is being translated into 22 different languages. Urvashi Bahuguna is a poet and essayist. She is the author of Terrarium, which is a collection of poems and was published this year, and has a forthcoming novel titled No Straight Thing Was Ever Made, slated for 2021. Urvashi grew up in Goa and currently lives and works in Delhi. I'm going to hand this over now to Urvashi, and thank you, all three of you, for being with us today and making the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishta. Thank you, Sunaparanta, for hosting us today. I'm really looking forward to our session, and welcome to all of our attendees. Thank you, Mathangi and Deepa, for making time. We'd like to start off the session by inviting our authors to read short excerpts from their novels to give everyone a little bit of feel of their writing, anyone who hasn't read the book yet. Deepa, can you start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and it's lovely to meet all of you online. So my novel, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line, is mostly told from the point of view of a 9-year-old boy named Jay, and he watches a lot of cop shows on TV and thinks he's a detective. So when children start disappearing from his neighborhood, he decides to look for them using these techniques that he thinks he has picked up from TV, and he enlists the help of two of his friends, Buddy and Faiz. So it is a story about the disappearances of children and how it affects a community that's neglected by the outside world. But we see the events unfold through the eyes of children, and so it's their humor, their belief in the supernatural are also there in the book. So while primarily the story is told from Jay's voice, there are also the mythological stories that the children and the community believe in. And so I'll read a brief extract from one of the mythological stories. And this comes about a third of a way into the book, but there are no spoilers, so I think it's safe to read it. We believe jinns moved into this palace around the time our last kings died, their hearts broken by the crooked victories of white men who claim to be our rulers. No one knows where the jinns came from, if Allah Ta'ala sent them, or if they were summoned here by the feverish utterances of the devout. They've been here for so long, they must have watched the walls of this palace crumble, the pillars soften with moss and creepers, and pythons slither over cracked stones like dreams wavering in the light of dawn. Every year, they must feel the wind trembling the champa trees in the garden, shearing flowers as fragrant as vials of attar. We can't see jinns unless they take the form of a black dog or a cat or a snake. But we feel their presence the moment we step into these palace grounds, in the rustle that tickles the backs of our necks like the branch of a shrub, in the breeze blowing our shirts, and in the lightness we feel in our hearts as we pray. We can see you're frightened, but listen. We have been caretakers of this jinn palace for years, and we can assure you they've never harmed anyone. Yes, there are bad jinns and trickster jinns and infidel jinns who want to possess your soul, But the ones who live here, the jinns who read the letters that believers have written to them, they are the good jinns Allah Ta'ala shaped out of smokeless fire to serve us. They are saints. Look now at the crowd thronging these grounds, flinging cubes of meat up into the sky for kites to catch, leaving bowls of milk for dogs on the odd chance that one of the kites or the dogs is a jinn in another form. These believers are from all faiths. It's not just us Muslims. Here there are Hindus and Sikhs and Christians and maybe even Buddhists. They come here clutching the letters they've written to the jinns, and they will paste their petitions on the powdery walls. At night when the gates are locked and the ash tips of joss sticks collapse to the ground, the jinns will read the letters scented with incense and flowers. They read fast, not like us. If they find your wish genuine, they will grant your request. As caretakers of the jinn's home, we've seen that happen many times. But don't take our word for it. Over there by the champa tree, you will notice a grey-haired man barking orders at 4 boys carrying cauldrons of biryani. For years, his daughter had a constant cough that no medicine could cure. He took her to government hospitals, to private hospitals that looked like 5-star hotels, to a god woman who lived in a hut by the Arabian Sea, and to a Baba's ashram high up in the Himalayas. She was X-rayed and CT scanned and MRI'd. She wore rings with blue gems and green gems and purple gems for good health. Nothing helped. Then someone told them about this place, and the father came here with a letter for the jinn saints. He would have done anything for his daughter by then, pulled out all his teeth and tied them up in a satin cloth like pearls if that was what the jinns wanted. His letter to the jinns was brief. Some people write pages listing their grievances, and they attach copies of birth certificates and marriage certificates and sale deeds or houses that are being divided unequally and disagreeably between brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts. The father, however, just wrote, "Please take pity on us and cure my daughter of her cough." He showed the letter to us. That's how we know. He pinned a photo of his daughter from before to his letter, before the cough made a rattling skeleton out of her. And now, see for yourself. The daughter is a girl in the green salwar kameez standing by the champa. Her hair is covered fully with a scarf so as not to tempt the jinns. Even the good jinns have a weakness for beautiful girls, we will be honest with you. But doesn't she look well? There's color in her cheeks, strength in her bones, not a bend in her spine, and her cough is gone. She's getting married next month. The father is thanking the jinns by feeding biryani to visitors. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa. Mathangi, if you're ready.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here, especially with Deepa and Urvashi, who are 2 writers I really love. So my book is called People's History of Heaven, and it's the story of 5 girls growing up in a slum in Bangalore that's about to be destroyed. And since it's about stolen land, I always start my readings with a land acknowledgement. So I'm reading to you from Denver, which is the original ancestral unceded territory of the Apache, Cheyenne, Sioux, and Ute people. So a lot of people were removed from the place where I live right now. And I encourage you to look and see who lived on your land originally, because many of us are not the original inhabitants of our land. So the passage that I'm going to read for you today, it's a very short passage about one of the main characters in the book. So again, the book centers on 5 girls and their families. And this passage is about Deepa, and Deepa is blind, and she's the only one of the girls who isn't in school. So as the novel opens, the bulldozers are coming into the slum called Heaven, and they're about to destroy the habitation. And Deepa is the only one who, one of the 5 girls who was actually there because she wasn't at school. So this is from the first chapter, which is called Breaking the Sky. Once, when Deepa was watching Padma's brothers, an airplane cut a whirring path across the sky. Deepa couldn't see it, of course, but she could hear it roar. "Wow," Padma's brother said, jumping up and down and pointing at the sky. "Wow, wow, wow, Akka, what's that thing called?" "An aeroplane," Deepa said, stumbling across the jagged vowels, the serrated consonants, the syllables sharp as shattered stones. "It flies so high, Akka," the youngest boy said. "Why doesn't it break the sky?" "Cheap, what nonsense." You can't break the sky. But that aeroplane looks so pointy, the youngest said. Like a screwdriver, the oldest said, or a needle. If it did break the sky, I bet it would make a big sound, the youngest said, throwing his hands up in the air. I bet it would be an explosion. Don't be ridiculous. You can't break the sky, Deepa said again, more firmly this time. But really, she wasn't so sure. What would it sound like if you broke the sky? Would it be a jagged shattering of sharp-edged glass? A frayed ripping of overwashed fabric? Or would the sky break the way skin breaks, silently oozing and smelling like blood? This afternoon, when the bulldozers came, Deepa feels the air tremble, the clouds shudder. Hears the sounds of cooking pots and pressure cookers, light bulbs and radios, table fans and kerosene cans being thrashed into pieces, being beaten into the ground. Oh, she thinks. So this is what it sounds like. This is what it sounds like to break the sky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for reading. I really enjoyed both of your novels, and I wanted to start off with a general question about writing for both of you. Could you tell us a little bit about what place writing holds in your everyday life?
So for me, Joan Didion has this wonderful quote that I write to find out what I'm thinking. I think I'm getting it a little bit wrong, but to paraphrase, that's what it is. And for me, that's what writing has always been. It's the way I process the world. It's sort of a therapy for me. And this book actually came out of, I moved to India in 2012. I moved to Bangalore because I had a Fulbright fellowship to study early childhood education. So that's actually my background, is education policy and practice. And, you know, I was going to these Anganwadis every day, and I was surrounded by, and I didn't realize that Anganwadis, in addition to being early childhood centers, they were also some of the only places where poor women could gather freely and in public. And so while I was supposed to be doing my academic research, which I did some of it, Fulbright Foundation, I was surrounded by all these other voices, from everything from the 12-year-old who had run away from home, to the widow who had lived in the slum for 40 years, to the 22-year-old new mother. And they were just so different from the idea of India that I had sort of grown up with. So this book came out of me going home from my research and trying to process what I was seeing. And I never thought it would be published. I never thought it would become a book. And so now that I have a book out, I have 2 books out now. The place of writing in my life has changed a little bit. I'm trying to get back to that place where it's just sort of therapy and processing and just a joyful thing, which it is still some of the time. But it's definitely changed now that I know that there's a possibility that people could be reading what I'm writing, which before it didn't feel like there was a possibility of that. But it's always been a very important sort of therapeutic place in my life, and also something that I sort of do compulsively.
For me, I think a lot of it is quite similar to what Mathangi had said, in the sense that, you know, it is how I make sense of my life and of the world. And I think a different kind of person would sort of, you know, stand in a street corner and give speeches and be more outgoing. And I'm not that kind of person at all. And so for me, sitting at my desk and writing is how I engage with the world. And I think I've done it in one form or the other sort of all my life. I was a journalist for many years, and I worked as a print journalist primarily because I couldn't, you know, stand in front of a camera and speak, but writing was how I could talk about those issues that I felt, you know, angry about, or which sort of affected me in some way. And it was by writing that I felt I could contribute or do something. And I know that sounds very idealistic, and it's not a kind of popular thing to say, but that was the kind of person that I was. And with this book in particular, it primarily came about because a whole lot of my work was with children. I was talking to children for, my beat was education, and I was talking to them for various stories. And I think all of us know these numbers about the number of missing children in India, that, you know, it's something like one child goes missing every 8 minutes. And I think it's kind of lost its shock value, and nobody really cares about it as much as I think they should. Whereas in the West, for instance, the disappearance of a child is a big thing. And obviously that also depends on class and on race. But it is still discussed so much. But, we don't really talk about the huge number of kids who go missing. And because it spent so much time with them, and I was really interested in how they viewed the disappearances and how they understood it. So this was a way. I initially thought I would write it as a report, but I moved away from India and from journalism. But those questions remain with me, and writing this novel was a way of figuring out through fiction how those children might be experiencing the disappearances of their friends or family.
I was really struck by the fact that both of your novels, I mean, of course, they share more than one thing in common. They're both about children in urban slums. But another thing struck me was that they're both also a people's history in their own way. And a broad definition of a people's history is a history that's told from the point of ordinary people rather than leaders or elite classes. And I wanted to know what drove that decision for the two of you. Why did you choose to tell it from the perspective of children, and these children in particular?
So for me, I think it was about, because I hadn't seen their voices in the mainstream discourse, there were all these stories about children's disappearances, which only came out if there was, a very shocking crime was revealed, or if it was related to the sort of perpetrators of the crime. And there was absolutely, I think, almost no focus on the children or the families. So I did want to tell the story from their perspective. And, it was, in many ways, it was an extension of the work that I had done as a journalist, because so many of my stories were, about asking children what they felt about kind of government policy and whether it percolated down to their level. And it was about examining that. And so I did, it was just my natural interest. That was where, my attention went immediately as to how they processed it. And I also think it had something, if I were to look back, it had something to do with the fact that I grew up in Kerala, which was at that time a very socialist society. And it was, not uncommon for me just standing, waiting for a bus as a child, or going to the grocery store to sort of overhear political conversations. And it was a society that really valued equality, and at least, in public, that was what was, it was always discussed. It was a society that valued egalitarianism, and there were discussions about human rights and gender, which I think is not so common now, perhaps. And definitely, I've not seen that and replicated in other societies, but it was there in Kerala when I was growing up, and I was very much informed by that. And I never thought that, a person had to have wealth or power to have sort of worth or value in society, because that was not the kind of society I grew up in. And I think that definitely made me the kind of person that I am today. And, a lot of decisions that I took throughout my life about what I wrote about and how I lived my life that came from that society.
So, sorry, Deepa, that was such a good answer. I actually, really at my core, I'm a children's writer. So my first novel was a middle grades novel. And the way I make my money is I write children's stories for educational publishing. And I work for Sesame Street, Sesame Workshop, which makes Gully Gully Sim Sim in India. And I've worked on that show as well. So it's just sort of my instinct to write from the perspective of children. And actually my editor on this book was like, when he acquired the book, was like, you should probably put some of the mothers in, because you're a grown-up. So maybe put some of the grown-ups in as well. But the reason that I, wrote from the perspective of children living in slums, also I think a big part of it was because my research was on early childhood education. And many of these Anganwadis are in elementary schools. And one of them was actually on the ground floor of an elementary school where the top level was a children's home for girls specifically. So throughout my research process, I was interacting with a lot of children. And so that was the primary perspective that I was getting. They were also much more patient with like my American accented Tamil and my Kannada, which I was like learning on the job as I was there. So they were a little more willing to talk to me than some of the adults who were like, just learn Kannada and then we'll talk. Although in Bangalore, Anganwadi workers in particular can speak like a ridiculous amount of languages. So usually we could communicate in that one, it was fine. But I think the main reason I wrote this book is sort of similar to Deepa. I worked very extensively with working class communities in the US. I started out as a public school teacher. I worked for the New York City government. I've always been sort of involved in communities that where I'm sort of the more privileged person. But growing up in America, I had certain ideas about what poverty looked like in India, and specifically what female poverty looked like in India. And then when I went there as an adult, with the critical lens of, having studied critical race theory in grad school, and, Marxism and all of that, I went and found that all of my assumptions were wrong, and that I had this sort of ingrained superiority in me that I needed to overcome. And I think hopefully this experience has really, changed me that way. So part of me writing this book was also because I felt, was so wrong about what slums were like. I wanted to sort of present a different perspective. And I also feel like, female characters in books throughout literature and also in Indian literature are often relegated to the sidelines. They're often love interests or they're prostitutes, quite frankly. And I just wanted to show a different sort of history that came from a female perspective that was empowered and wasn't about being the victim, and in which women were the center of the story.
That makes a lot of sense. And I remember thinking when I was reading your novel that I wanted so much to see these women grow up and to see what they'd become, because I really did want to know what are the alternatives to what we see in popular culture, what actually becomes of these women, because I don't think that like you see that in fiction very much.
Yeah, and realistically, I'm not sure how many of them would have grown up to be successful, but I think many of them might have grown up to be happy,
So I wanted to ask you about genre. You're someone who, when you published this novel, some amount of the coverage that the book received was along the lines of, what genre does this fit into? Was this written for children or adults or young adults? And I was reading your interviews, and in a couple of them, you've kind of like tried to move the question away from genre. And, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you think, as a reading culture, we happen to be so obsessed with dividing books into different genres, and why it might not matter as much as people think it does.
Yeah, it's funny, when I wrote the book, I thought it was going to be YA, because that's young adult, because that's what I'm comfortable writing, right? Although my current project is memoir, so that's not totally moving beyond all these things. So when I submitted it to my agent, I said it was YA, and she read it and she was like, I don't know if this is YA, and she sent it to a whole bunch of different editors who had different opinions. And I'm actually really grateful that she marketed it or tried to sell it as an adult book, because she was, I'm American, so she's American and was trying to sell it in the US. And I think as much as there's this movement to have diverse books in the US, I think it's very difficult to sell a YA book that is not set in the United States. In fact, I tried to sell one that was not set in the United States, and some of the feedback I got was not craft related, and made me think that maybe there was an idea that there was no market for this among, kids in the US, which maybe has changed, because The Night Diary won a huge award, it's a beautiful book. It's YA. It's about a 12-year-old experiencing partition and crossing from Pakistan into India. Anyway, all this to say, I think that these genres are just marketing tools. I think publishing is such a strange industry, because selling art is such a strange thing, because art is not meant for a capitalist society. Art is meant to be shared, right? So the idea that you can market art puts all these restrictions on what artists, after artists produce what they produce, it puts all these restrictions on whatever their intentions were. So my book, there was a lot of, some of it was debate and some of it was criticism, like, why isn't this classified as YA? And some of that I felt like, well, I didn't classify it. So I'm not sure how I'm supposed to change that. I mean, some of the craft critiques are fine, but things like that, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do about it. But, To Kill a Mockingbird is YA, right? A Separate Piece is YA. Like, there's so many American classics that are Catcher in the Rye is YA, and these are all considered classics. So I feel like genre is such a strange thing, and I when I write, I try really hard to just write what I want to write, and then let everybody else kind of deal with it later. But it is a strange thing, because while I was writing, I don't know, I was just trying to write a good story, and I think that's true of most writers, you know.
Deepa, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your journalism, because I know that that was your background when you first started interacting with these stories of the missing children. You said your beat was education, and in an interview I read that you were talking about these children and how they surprised you in a way. I'm just going to read out a short quote from an interview that you did. Many of them were working or weren't able to study because of their difficult financial or domestic circumstances. Despite this, they were often cheeky and witty, if not downright sarcastic. I drew from the memories of those interviews. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what those interviews were like, or what sort of questions did you ask the children? What was that interaction like? And it's just so fascinating to me that that grew into a novel later on.
I would say that sort of, it was the cornerstone for creating the characters more than the novel itself, because I worked for newspapers, and I think Urvashi, you would know if, you've also done journalism, and a lot of it is dictated by what the editors want, and especially if you're working, for a daily newspaper and you've got these deadlines and you have to file a couple of stories every day and you're running around Delhi or Bombay trying to do that. So it was, a lot of these stories were actually about government policy and whether it was working or not. So I think I wrote a whole series of pieces on the right to education bill, for instance, when it came out, and whether kids were benefiting from it, and as a result of which, were they going to school or not. A lot of it was about what were the challenges that they faced. So the questions that I asked were primarily around, what I wanted to achieve in the story. So it would be like, are you happy with the facilities that you have at the school? And, I could see for myself that the school, for instance, lacked certain facilities, very basic ones like, sanitation or water or a good blackboard. But obviously, as kids, they're not interested in talking about any of that with you. They're interested in playing, or they're interested in like eating. They're quite caught up in the present moment, and they're not like an adult would have been, try to be polite, and they'd have tried to talk to you, engage with you in that sense. But with children, they're not really interested. So I would talk to them about what they like to watch on TV, so that was like essentially my way in, because I think in India, everybody watches films and, everyone watches TV, and that's a way of getting to get children to sort of talk to you. So it was primarily, a lot of it was just kind of, idle chatter, and then for me to get the one or two quotes that I needed for the story itself. And what I essentially remembered was them rolling their eyes at my kind of, very technical questions, which they were not interested in. And obviously, when you're writing a news report, you don't really put all that in, if it's like kind of 500 words in a newspaper, for instance. So a lot of that didn't, their character and how they came across didn't really make it to the news reports. But I sort of had a memory of it. And I think the characters in the novel are an amalgamation of these various children that I'd interviewed over, more than a decade.
When you were interviewing these children, would you also speak to their families? Since you met, I'm speculating here, but it seems like the children were a little bit reticent. So were you able to fill in the gaps a little bit by talking to people around them?
Yeah, I mean, with the news story, you're obviously talking to, every stakeholder. That means the school authorities and the government officials who are meant to be taking care of a school, for instance, and also their families. But sometimes, I would find the kids. I remember in Delhi, a lot of the kids I spoke to for these stories on the education bill were actually, they were working as rack pickers, so they didn't have anybody around. And so I would find them sort of under a railway track, for instance, or near a flyover picking things. And then I would have a chat with them. So their parents were not always present. And of course, I tried to talk to them about what they wanted to do, whether they were, if they saw themselves going to school or not. But I would say that they were, it wasn't, there was some sadness sometimes, but it was not often the case. And I wouldn't want to make any sort of generalizations because every child is different, and kids deal with that sort of situations differently. And obviously there's a lot of horror on the streets as well, which, as we are all aware. But a lot of them, they were just trying to have fun and essentially trying to run away from me and just, play with their friends. Yeah.
That's something that comes across in your novel as well, Mathangi, where sisterhood and joy and humor, there's such an important part of your story. And I would love to hear why you chose to draw that in, or why it was such an important component for you.
So, a lot of the reason that that's in there is because that was what I was seeing. There was a lot of joy in sort of my interactions with these women and girls. And also I was this fascinating creature because I was like Tamil, but I was American, and I was like darker skinned than them, but I was also higher caste than them. Like all of this stuff was very strange and kind of wonderful to them, I think, So there was a lot of joy in sort of my interactions with them and in learning, just hanging out with them and hearing the gossip and just being, one of the women at the center eventually. But, the other sort of more philosophical reason that I wanted to put joy in there is around the time that my book came out. So it was in 2018. So a year before my book came out, the Indian government published a study saying that there are 63 million women missing from the population, which is an incredible amount of people, and missing meaning that statistically, there should be 63 million. If you predicted like regular population trends, there should be 63 million women in India that are just not there. And they're not there through sex selective abortion, or maybe they were not taken care of as a child, or maybe, they had abusive husbands or something. And so it's like a treacherous life to be an Indian woman, and particularly treacherous if you're a working class Indian woman. And I just wanted, I feel like culture is so tied to policy and so tied to attitudes and so tied to survival, honestly, that part of my motivation in documenting these women is to show like we're not going to be invisible anymore. You know what I mean? You can't make us invisible. Like, we're here. Because I feel like the way that you disappear people is that you just pretend that they don't exist in the first place, right? And so I really wanted to show the joy in communities. And, I tried really hard in the book to also balance, as I think Deepa was sort of talking about before, there's a lot of joy in these communities, and there's also a lot of heartbreak. And it's very, very difficult to live in Islam. It's very, very difficult to be poor. It's very, very difficult to live in Islam, be poor, and be female, right? But sorrow is not the whole story of anybody's life, right? Just like joy is not the whole story of anybody's life. And I think that the kind of friendship and caretaking and solidarity that women feel for each other is very real, no matter what class you are, no matter where you come from. I certainly have experienced that in my life. And I think there was a joy to that I really wanted to document. And that, I felt was a truer story than many of the stories I've read about women being victims. Because, women are survivors of all kinds of violence, but that doesn't mean that they're just doormats, right? So I really wanted to present a more nuanced picture that was more true to the idea that I have of myself and of Indian women in general.
Deepa, can I ask you about the supernatural elements in your novel? Because you read out an excerpt that's from one of the collective voices in the book, and that deals greatly with jinns. And could you tell us a little bit about why you chose to incorporate that in the novel? It's almost as if there's this belief that a Djinn is disappearing these children, because it's too painful to imagine a human kidnapper behind these heinous crimes for the people in the locality.
Yeah, I mean, I did see the supernatural as something, people turn to for both comfort, and they also fear it. I think that exists in our culture, that, there's both, there's a benevolent side, and there's also a side that creates fear. And we do approach religion that way, I think, in many ways. And I wanted the book to reflect that. I actually didn't know that there would be jinns in the book when I started writing it, because, I'm not a planner at all. All I had was Jay's voice. And so when I was writing him, I realized, oh, this is a kid who believes in jinns. And then I had to figure out where he had picked that up from. And I realized that, obviously for children, it comes from their friends, their family, and their community. And so I was trying to work out what would be the, beliefs prevalent in this community, and what were the kind of stories that they told themselves. And as I was writing, I realized these stories acquired sort of even more importance because they were being let down by, all the institutions that should have been supporting them. So I think we can turn to the police. The expectation is that the government institutions, the police, the politicians will intervene on their behalf, and it wasn't happening. So, and I've seen it often in my own life, with my own family and my own community, that when people sort of feel they've lost all hope is when they sort of start turning to these kind of stories, which you may not believe otherwise, and especially with regard to the supernatural. And one of the things that I'd seen as a reporter was that, especially with street children, and often in Delhi, there was this, they were often talk about ghosts and spirits. And partly I think this is because they didn't have, the support of home, and they didn't have sort of brick walls to go back to. And so they believed that people who had died before them, people they knew and who had died, were still around to look after them, because, there were no parents or teachers for guidance. So the mythical story with which Djinn Patrol starts, which is about this man named Mental who has a bunch of rat pickers. It's actually based on a real story. Obviously I've used my imagination to create this character of Mental, but the bare bones of it, which is that there was a rat tag group of boys who were picking bottles at railway station around Delhi, and one of them died. And after that, these kids would say that, the dead child is still around and guarding them, and because he's died so young, he's got unfinished business. So I did, I think from that experience of having talked to those children and having listened to their belief systems, I wanted the book to reflect that as well. Yeah.
Speaking about how the book evolved, I wanted to ask both of you about what the editing process was like. What were some of the hard parts of that journey? What were some helpful processes within it, if you'd like to share?
So Deepa, when you said you're not a planner, I'm exactly the same way. So I learned this when I moved back to the US. Apparently here there's two kinds of writers. They call them plotters, and then they call them pantsers, because pantsers fly by the seat of their pants and just sort of like see where the story goes. And I'm a definite pantser. I'm not a plotter also. So for me, the editing process was actually really interesting, because after I sold the book, first of all, I just want to say I was very lucky, because my work was pulled off the slush pile by my agent's reader, and that's how I acquired my agent. And both my agent and my editor, and just my press in general, I've heard horror stories about people from the global south writing and then having their Western editors sort of tell them what their reality is. But that was not my experience at all. I was very, very lucky to have editors and agents who were like, well, you lived in India, you are Indian, like you are the authority. And they never really tried to change what I was trying to say. And so that was really helpful and wonderful. I think the most interesting part of my editing process is when I got my agent in April, and then I turned in a final draft to her in July. And then a week after I turned in the draft to her, I got matched. My daughter's adopted, so we got matched with my daughter. So we brought my daughter home in August, and then in October, I got my book contract. So 2016 was like a really big year. So right around the time I got my book contract, my editor sent me an editorial note and was like, as I sort of alluded to earlier, he was like, the kids are great, but you have all of these really interesting mother figures. So why don't you build out the mothers? So during the editing process, I was actually building out the stories of the mothers as I was trying to figure out, rather unsuccessfully at first, how to be a mother. And not only how to be a mother, but how to be a mother of a child who had been living in a children's home, and therefore, like most adopted children, had all kinds of attachment issues and was, she's the loveliest kid and the best thing that's ever happened to me, and she's very well adjusted now. But that first year, for many adopted parents in India, it was quite difficult. So I was trying to write these stories about motherhood while I was trying to become a mother, and my editor was very supportive, and so was my agent. And for me, the process was just so eye-opening because I was so much more sympathetic to the adult characters than I had been in the past. So like Deepa, whose section I read before, her mother pulls her out of school. And I had sort of intended her to be the villain, but then as I'm dealing with my own, 1-year-old who is like, who are you, lady? And like, why did you bring me home? And like, what am I doing in this house, right? I was like, well, my decision-making process now is just so different than it was a month ago before I was responsible for another human in a country that I'm not from, trying to figure out how to be a mom. So I think I became much more sympathetic to the adult characters. And I think my editor was very helpful in sort of nudging me along and being like, okay, well, what are you experiencing? And like, how can you put that in the book?
Yeah, I think for me, it was, I had this first draft, and that's how I knew what I wanted to say in the book. And so there was, minor editing when I had to sort of look at pace and narrative urgency and characterization, things that I hadn't thought about before, and whether I was sort of had a fondness for repeating certain words or, have the characters repeat certain gestures. And so you realize all that only while editing. Once the book went out, so it was quite similar to Mathangi's, that I got, feedback from my editors. And then I had to sort of sit down and figure out what all I agreed with and, what I didn't want to do. So I think for me, it was useful that I had been in MA workshops and writing workshops where, you've got 10 people telling you what they think is right and wrong with your piece of writing. And so I had a sense of, what really serves the story and, who really gets your piece of writing, because a lot of it is just dictated by taste. And so you have to figure out, is this in the best interest of the characters and what I want to achieve in the novel itself. So I did a similar process with my editor's notes, which were, really helpful. And also it is in many ways a privilege because, nobody really pays that kind of attention to your work other than yourself. So it is a privilege to have, two people who are really experienced give you their feedback. For me, I think some of the questions were around I think we spoke about this, Urvashi, I can't remember when we had the interview, about the number of, as you say, Indian words in the book. And so do you keep that? And what do you explain? What do you not, without sort of losing the integrity of, the voice of the characters? So there's a lot of back and forth discussions on those subjects. Yeah.
I want to ask one last question. I think we have time to both of you. Would you share one book or author that you return to when you find yourself stuck in your writing or looking for inspiration?
I'll go first. Yeah, so it's for me, I think it is Michael Ondaatje, whose books I read as, I think, first as a teenager, and his books are the ones that have, come with me every house I've moved to, which is like, at this point, I think more than 30 perhaps. So the books have been battered, but they've stayed with me. And I really, for me, I love the lyricism of his writing and this often very striking imagery. And so I always turn to his words when I feel stuck with my own writing. But other than that, there's also what we just discussed, which is sort of writing history from below. So many of his books are about characters who don't feature in historical records. So like In the Skin of Lion, which is one of my favorite novels, is about the immigrants who built Toronto, and you don't see their names on any of the bridges which are named after uh, prime ministers or queens or kings. And so he writes about those people who don't feature in history, and that's something that I'm really interested in.
For me, the book that I always go back to is Heartberries by Therese Marie Malhot. She's from Seabird Island. She's a Native American writer. And I go back both to her book and like her writing on writing. She's very much about writing your own truth and, not necessarily buying into the Western canon and really focusing on where you come from. And even if you come from multiple places like me, and about owning your own story. And she's a very lyrical writer, and she's a very efficient writer. So she always picks exactly the right word, and she never has too many. She has exactly the right amount of words and exactly the right words. And I don't know, her book and her essays always, they make me feel like I can do this. Like I don't have an MFA. I don't have any kind of writing training really. Although this, past couple of years since I've been back in the US, I've been taking classes and workshops. But just reading her, she's like, you can just be who you are and write, and you just have to put in the hours, So I often when I'm having trouble, it's because I'm having imposter syndrome or some kind of like lack of self-confidence. So she always brings me back to myself.
Thank you, all three of you, for this amazing session. I kind of want to go back and read both of the books and, with your perspectives and see how that changes things for me. Because I think when you hear authors read their own characters, their own stories, it changes things. Because that's the amazing thing about books versus movies. You get to picture your own reality as opposed to in a movie where you see things a bit more visually. I did want to start with the first question, which is about place. So both of your novels deal, place is quite a major character for both novels, I think. And how did you come to that? And how do you talk about a place which otherwise is kind of shunned by larger society? It's not necessarily looked at as the inhabitable part. It's not the desirable part of a city. It's kind of the corner of a city. So how did you incorporate place as a character, and what made you think of place as a character?
For me, it was really about just inhabiting Jay's world, his vision. And so it was just looking at his, where he lives, his neighborhood as he would see it. And it may not match, a grown-up's viewpoint, but it is his viewpoint. And it was very specific. I think even with the language, I tried to be as close as possible to how he would see it. So for instance, he doesn't refer to his own neighborhood as a slum. He calls it a basti, which is how I've heard, people describe their own neighborhoods. And then there's this word like, hi-fi flat for skyscrapers, which is again from, it was all picked up from their vocabulary. And so completely, I think for me, it was not at all looking at it as perhaps I would, because I would be, I think I would be exasperated by how, we force fellow humans to live in such situations. We don't really see poverty as, we don't see it as violence, and I do view it as a kind of a violence that we perpetrate on, others, and no one views it. I think a lot of people don't view it like that. And so I would be very angry, I think, at all times if I were to describe, this area as I saw it. But Jay doesn't, for him, it's just home. So it was really about entirely viewing it as he does and, how the other children do. And for me, it was really sort of occupying a different vertical perspective. It's much smaller, and, what he sees, what he notices are animals and food stalls. So focusing on that for me was, it was the only way in which I could be honest about his lived experience, I would say.
For me, I wouldn't say place is a character. It's like place was the stakes in my book, right? So place was the thing that everyone was fighting for. And because, as you know, as Deepa was saying, like, this place is home, right? And there are many problems with it. And in the book, I try not to shy away from the problems, but just because there's problems with where you live. And I'm saying this as somebody who lives in the US and is like about to face the, you know, the election in which, yeah, you know, so I definitely come from a very flawed place as well, is what I'm trying to say. But, you know, there were a few ways in which the land was the stakes here. First, the very kind of obvious thing where the slum was about to be destroyed, right? Place was community. So if the place was going to be destroyed, the community was going to be destroyed. And then, you know, Bangalore as a whole was also the stakes, because so many of the narratives I heard, both from, you know, the women I was seeing every single day when I was in this place, and also from my husband, who grew up in Bangalore in the 90s and was like the classic grumpy Bangalore uncle who was like, everything was so much better. The city is so terrible now. Bangalore is not, you know, like that narrative. So Bangalore sort of changes with the book along with the girls, and not necessarily for the better, you know? So when I was thinking about sort of a craft question, the land for me was the stakes. Just in terms of writing instinctively, I'm someone who has moved around a lot, and I've never really lived in one place for, I mean, the longest I've lived somewhere, I lived in New York for 8 years, and that's the longest I've ever lived anywhere. So I'm very sensitive to place, and also as part of my research I was doing, ethnographic research, I was taking notes. So I was taking a lot of notes about place that was very much in my conscious. And when when you're an ethnographer, one thing they teach you is this idea of strange making, which is to look at something that you think is familiar and make it strange, and examine your assumptions about it and try and look at it from a new perspective. So I think that, you know, I had all these assumptions about slums and poverty, and I think that taking notes and being in a research position helped me sort of shift that perspective. And, you know, I also want to echo what Deepa was saying. There's a really famous lawyer here named Brian Stevenson, who's Black, and he does anti-death penalty work. And he says that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And I very much believe that. And I think part of the fight for justice is making impoverished places and working class places more visible. Because, you know, small side story and then I'll stop. So while we were living in Bangalore, my husband was doing some work in kind of rural Tamil Nadu. And I went with him a few times. And we would be in the middle of nowhere, and Google Maps would have like the full path. We'd be on like this borrowed scooter, and I'd be sitting on the back. But we always knew where we were going because the roads were always there. In the middle of urban Bangalore, I'd be standing in the middle of a slum and trying to figure out what, you know, the directions I was getting. Like go past this booth and go past this landmark and whatever. And I opened my phone and the slums were just completely blank. Like there was nothing there. Because Google Maps actually erases slums so that governments can say, oh, this is unused land, so we can just demolish it. And so it's a very political decision to not be on the map. So for me, writing about this place was also about establishing it as real and visible. Because, you know, like I was saying, if something is real, it's a lot harder to justify destroying it. And it's a lot harder to keep perpetuating these cycles of injustice if these are actual humans. And, you know, I think erasure is such an act of violence, and it's so tied to the violence of poverty.
Thank you both for that brilliant perspective, I think. And what really stood out to me in both of these novels also was the idea of not at all trying to exoticize the place, the characters at all, as we've seen being done in other forms of art that deal with similar situations necessarily. And you read this as just a place and just children and their stories and their everyday. Like you said, Mathangi, it's not, nobody's life is only about sorrow or only about joy. There's a combination within all of them. I'm just going to end by asking all three of you, actually, if you had any advice for young writers, and if you could share one title that you're reading right now.
So I'm reading The 10,000 Doors of January, which is a fantasy novel set in the US, primarily in the US, by an author called Alex Harrow, which I'm enjoying greatly. In terms of advice, I would say read a lot. I know everyone says that, but it's still my go-to whenever I feel like I have something to learn. It's usually from other people's writing. Every book I read, no matter what genre it is, gives me new perspective, new ideas. It's not just a training ground. It's great to find inspiration. Yeah, that would be my one key thing.
It took me a minute to think of something for advice, because I'm always asking for advice. I really give advice. So, in terms of the books I'm reading Deepa's book, which is lovely, and everybody should definitely go out and buy. I'm also reading Agni Doshi's Girl in White Cotton, which I'm really enjoying. I'm having trouble reading one book at a time during the pandemic, so I'm reading many other things, but I'll just stop with those two. In terms of advice, I think discipline is very important, but I think self-compassion is also very important. So I have a job, I have a young kid that I'm a primary caretaker of, I have a family, and I write. So really writing is like the fourth thing that I do. So I don't work on my book projects every day, but I still work on them often enough that I finish. So I think, especially during the pandemic and everything else that's happening, it's very difficult to concentrate and sit and write for 3 hours a day. And if you have the capacity to do it, then do. But if you don't, I think it's about believing in yourself and finding time, whether that's once a week, whether that's once every 2 weeks, whether that's once every other day, to put the time in again. And also whether it's half an hour or 15 minutes, just find the time to do it. But also, if you can't do it every day, that doesn't mean you're not a writer. That just means you have a life, and I don't know, for me, maybe this is different for Urvashi and Deepa, but like, I can't live off of my book money. So I have to work in order to, sustain myself and my family. So, there will be other priorities. So I think be disciplined, but also be kind to yourself.
I'm just going to add to that to say, I also think it's a function of privilege to be able to write every day. And a lot of people say, go do that. And I really think, especially for me, I've got, like a lot of people, I've also got other responsibilities, and it's not always possible. So one thing I found which helps is to sort of just read a paragraph or something of, if you're working on a long form project like a novel, which can take years, I find it useful to just read something, change a comma or two, and that's one way to just stay in the world. And whereas I find that if I don't look at it at all, look at the file for sort of 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch, then I have difficulty getting back to that world. Just doing something really minor every day, I think, is one way to keep going when it's a long project. And it's about discipline and stamina, and you really have to believe in what you want to say and yourself. Keep working on a novel, as a part to something shorter. And in terms of books, I'm reading Mathangi's book, and also just finished Diana Evans' Ordinary People, which I sort of highly recommend. And I was telling a friend, it's like Jonathan Franzen's Corrections, but Corrections was so popular, but it does it's very similar in observing life of Black men and women in Britain. And, it's very domestic, but also personal, and the political is combined so beautifully. So I highly recommend it. Yeah.
Thank you, all three of you, for making the time to be with us today. Thank you to everybody who's signed up and is here for this as well.